Speaking a lot about gentrification before we even kind of knew what that word meant, right? Well, I would like to thank everyone and welcome you to our monthly community conversation with the Power, Action, and Light Social Justice Center, or the PAL. This month, we're coming together with Citizen Action of New York and Housing Justice for All, as well as having a representative from Legal Aid to help us navigate this current housing crisis. As most of us know, the eviction moratorium has been extended. However, there hasn't been all that much information about how we create housing stability in the meantime. Today, we're going to talk about resources that are available to individuals in this crisis, but we're also going to talk about some things that we can come together as a community to fight the injustice that's associated with housing here in Chemung County. So today we're here both live on Zoom as well as live streaming to our Facebook page. So please let me just take a couple of minutes to go over some guidelines. First, if you are not the person speaking, please make sure that you are muted. We will have mute doctors in the room just in case you forget. Also, please feel free to use the chat in the Zoom room or on Facebook. We'll be monitoring those as well. If someone is saying something and you want to add to it, please feel free to write stack in the chat and we will know that you are asking to be the next person in line. So today we're going to be joined by Andrew Roby of the Law New York, who's going to be here to talk about some individual resources here available in Chemung County. We also have Rebecca Gerard of Citizen Action and Housing Justice to talk about what we can do as a community. But one thing I would like to do before we start is to take a moment to recognize that the lands that we are standing on today are stolen. Indigenous people have been marginalized and discriminated against for as long as this country has stood. We ask everyone to take a moment to recognize the many legacies of violence and displacement that have brought us to this moment, and allow that to energize and motivate us to come together across all lines of division to lift from the bottom so that everyone rises. Thank you so much. I'm really glad we got to start with that song from the 90s from Living Color talking about open letter to a landlord. It's really important that we come together as a community to have these conversations. These things are not happening in vacuums. We are all impacted. So let's talk a little bit about exactly what does that mean when we face housing insecurity and when we're talking about our neighbors who are struggling to try to figure out what happens when the moratorium is turned off. What if I can't pay my rent? What kind of impact does that really have on our neighbors? Let's just take a minute to think about that.
Home is where the heart is, and also where your health is. Did you know where we live affects how long and how well we live? Yet safe, secure, and quality housing is out of reach for millions of Americans. In fact, a person working full time with federal minimum wage cannot afford a two-bedroom rental anywhere in the US. In Michigan, workers would need to make at least $17.25 an hour to afford to rent a modest two-bedroom home. According to Harvard University's Joint Center for Housing Studies, 32% of all households in the US are cost burdened, meaning they pay more than 30% of their income for the roofs over their heads. Affordability is just one of the key drivers of housing instability, an umbrella term that includes everything from mold and pest infestations to frequent moves and overcrowded conditions. Homelessness is the most extreme form of housing instability. All of this has a profound effect on health. For instance, residential crowding affects mental health, stress levels, and sleep. Lead paint exposure could cause cognitive delays and brain damage in children. And people living in shelters or on the streets are at a higher risk for a chronic condition, physical disability, mental illness, or substance use disorder. Even our neighborhoods create or limit our opportunities to be healthy. Access to schools, businesses, and grocery stores, walkability, safety, public resources, and water and air quality all play a role in shaping health outcomes. Take, for example, Detroit's Del Rey neighborhood. Once dubbed the most polluted area in Michigan, It lies between a string of industrial plants, pumping a toxic stew of chemicals into the air. Here, residents are plagued with severe headaches, asthma, and some of the highest cancer rates in the state. The evidence is clear. A home is more than just four walls. It's the foundation to thrive and a vital part of a person's health.
I think it's really important for us to consider the overall impact that folks have from housing and how it just affects every single part of your life. And that's so clearly seen when you look at the health outcomes in Elmira in particular. When you know that living in 14901, you're going to live 10 years less than if you're in West Elmira. Like, go up the street a couple miles, and it's a 10-year difference of how long you're expected to survive. This is injustice, and this is why we're here. So thank you everyone for bearing with me through that introduction. I would like to take a moment to introduce our friend Andrew, who has joined us today, and let you introduce yourself a little bit.
Hi, yes, I'm a housing attorney with Law New York, Legal Assistance Western New York. We have 7 offices around the region. I work out of our Elmira office. Housing is my primary area. I'm not the only attorney in the office who does housing, but that's I'd usually be the first one that it goes to. I've been there a little over 2 years now. Started in early 2019, and yeah, it's a lot has changed, of course, over the time that I've been there. We had the major changes to landlord-tenant laws in 2019. Even prior to the pandemic. I can talk about that a little bit if anybody has questions. And then, of course, the pandemic hit, and major changes to the laws because of that as well. I've been in private practice for about 10 years before I joined Law New York. So I've been around the block, done a variety of things, but I've enjoyed this area, although I've noticed, as has already been discussed, a lot of people in hard situations. It's just, especially in Elmira, that's definitely a place in need, and a lot of people are trying to help, and I would like to think there's hope on the horizon. But I'm glad for this group, this new group, and any people, any citizens that want to help themselves and help other people, that are makes our job easier. So I'm not very good at tooting my own horn, I guess, but hopefully that covers it. If any, I'm here to talk about legal questions. So
Absolutely, that's great. Thank you so much. So Andrew, we did ask folks to submit some questions ahead of time, and one of the ones we heard a lot is, what do I do if my landlord is trying to evict me right now?
well, that is always a broad. There's a lot of possibilities there. Assuming the person means they've got court papers, they should call an attorney immediately if they don't know what anything means. And then, it doesn't have to be us. Any attorney can do it. But yeah, you shouldn't wait until you go to court to speak to an attorney. They can explain as soon as you get any kind of notice. So I'll start with that. The proper way for your landlord to do it, if they want to evict someone, is with a notice. First, it would be like, if it's non-payment, it would either be a 14-day notice, or if it's not non-payment, you're looking at like 30, 60, 90 days. Hopefully I'm not getting too far afield here, but that was one of the changes to the law in 2019. Is used to always be a 30-day notice, but they changed the law, so it's you're entitled to 60 days if you've been there for more than a year but less than 2, or 90 days if you've been there for 2 years or more. These are things to keep in mind. Like, even if the landlord has a reason to evict you, they have to give you certain notice first, depending on the situation. If they're accusing you of violating the lease, they still have to give you like a 10-day notice and opportunity to cure before they start a court case. Then after that notice period is expired, whatever the relevant notice is, they have to start a court case. So they have to serve you with court papers. So it's not lawful for them to just say you're evicted, get out, and to, but that doesn't mean they're not going to try it. And that's the second important point, is that, we have had plenty of situations with lockouts and other things, like where the landlord would try to shut the water off or shut the power off to force people out sooner. But that is very much against the law, and the police know this. So that, I would say, if the landlord is making threats to evict you, just speak with an attorney about it if you have any questions. But don't wait until you get to court. Don't wait until the last day. That's the worst thing that people do, like the last day before the expiration of the notice. Just if you have questions about anything, just ask. The worst we can say is no. It's not an area we can help with.
Right, right. So Law New York would have resources if, let's say, my landlord decided they were going to try to evict me today. One of my first steps would probably be to reach out to legal aid to see if I could get an attorney. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, that's that. And I'm not trying to like steer people to us necessarily. You can, free to choose your own attorney, but legal aid is for, low income people who can't afford one. And that's a lot of the people we're talking about that we're dealing with.
Absolutely.
We have on our website at lawny.org, we have informational articles for the public too, that you can look, you can, and some of it deals with eviction and other housing issues. So I'd suggest looking up those informational articles as well if you have any questions, even before you speak to an attorney. So
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. So now, what does this moratorium apply to? When we think about a moratorium, we think nobody can be evicted, and I know that's not exactly the case. How does that apply when as it stands today?
Well, currently as it stands, evictions could in theory proceed if people have not filed that hardship declaration. I'm sure you've heard of the so-called hardship declaration, that the landlord is supposed to serve a copy of that with the eviction papers. That's the number one thing I've been telling people lately, is if they haven't filled it out yet, it doesn't matter what stage of the case it's at. Just tell them to go fill it out, and to even be considered for the moratorium, that's part of it. Some judges are better than others toward tenants, in terms of, like, some judges are just treating it as a blanket prohibition on evictions, like they're just not doing any evictions for the period of the moratorium. And then, but some courts will apparently entertain evictions if you haven't filed one of those forms. So that's important to consider too. That's, of course, if one of the categories in the form applies to you. But if you have questions about whether the categories apply to you, then that's another thing you should speak to an attorney about. A lot of people are going to apply, even if you haven't like lost your job because of COVID, which is one of the categories. If one of the other categories it would be cost prohibitive or maybe health prohibitive to move. And that applies to a whole lot of people, where it's just, it's not practical to move for one reason or another. So the hardship declaration, I guess, is the one thing it's important to get the moratorium to apply. There are various executive orders that and administrative orders from the court system that lay out the terms of how the moratorium applies. But of course, the most recent extension to August 31st was via legislation that passed the legislature, signed by the governor, and all that. So that's as official as it gets. The moratorium doesn't apply to all types of evictions. It can apply to non-payment or holdovers, but as I mentioned earlier, like if it's a violation of the lease, the landlord is accusing you of violating the lease. Let's say you, I don't know, put holes in the wall or something, and that's the reason they want to evict you. But I don't think the moratorium doesn't apply to that type of eviction. But again, that doesn't mean you're screwed. There's pardon my language, but there's defenses to that as well, and those are difficult types of eviction cases to prove anyway, unless it's extremely obvious that the tenant's done something wrong. So I would just say don't just assume that the moratorium does not apply to you, but assume that there are steps you may have to take to make it apply to you. So that it's very broad, and it's been a very good thing, very helpful thing to tenants during the pandemic. But it's right. You're right that it's not universal. It's not 100% like I don't got to worry about anything. You know, there's still maybe steps you have to take. There's at least a chance that you don't, that it doesn't apply to you, or you know, if you're in one of those narrow categories, it doesn't. So something to keep in mind. You know, again, these are all things that on a case. I don't want to get into case specifics too much, but if there's if people have case specific questions about whether the moratorium applies to them, I would certainly invite them to ask us or to ask any attorney.
Great, great. Now, I heard you mention the hardship declaration. Some folks felt like when the last moratorium expired, that was the deadline. If you haven't filled out a hardship declaration yet, then forget it. It's not worth it at this point. Is that a true statement?
No. I mean, now that it's been extended, it's certainly the hardship declaration is still good. There was a bit of a mad scramble at the beginning of May because the moratorium had expired technically for a couple of days while we were waiting for them to pass the extension. And in that time, the courts were scheduling a bunch of appearances, and the hardship declaration as it existed at that time said May 1st. But I was having people fill it out anyway, because I said, you know, presumably this legislation is going to pass. And then even though it says in the instructions May 1st, the same form will apply, just with the new date. So no, absolutely, it's still good. It still works for the current extension of the moratorium.
That's great to hear. That is great to hear. Does anybody on the call have any questions when it comes to where we're at today or so far? All right. Well, again, please remember that the chat is available both online here in the Zoom room and in the Facebook live stream. We'll be happy to try to keep track of those as well. So, Andrew, are you very familiar with this new ERAP system that's going to be released next week? Have you had much chance to read up on that yet?
I've read up on some. I wouldn't describe myself as any sort of expert, but I've watched some training on it from the state, and there was a period of time where, of course, we were being told for several weeks that it's coming, it's just not, you know, online yet. I just saw that I think it was a link that you had provided in the email that it's about to be online as of June 1st. So that's very good. It's as I understand it, it requires some cooperation between the landlord and tenant. So it's like if either party can start the application, but so I haven't actually had a case yet of someone applying for those funds, but I anticipate a slew of them very shortly here, you know, for existing clients and for prospective new clients. I did in fact just have one attorney for a landlord express that his client was very interested in seeing if we could use that to get caught up. So that's a good sign, at least. I'm always glad to see that when the landlord wants to cooperate.
Absolutely.
Because they haven't always, but you know, I get part of it is they want their money, and it's like, well, you know, okay, here's the money, but you also there's other things to that, like the landlord has to agree to not evict them over money for a certain period of time, or they could still evict for other reasons if something comes up, I guess. But it's like if you're agreeing to take this money, you're agreeing not to evict the person over money. You're agreeing to let them stay for a period of time. The money can also be applied prospectively too, as I understand it. It could pay like the next, however, I don't remember the exact number, the next however many months of rent, not just back rent. So it's a really exciting and good resource. So.
Absolutely. I also heard that it will also apply for utilities. If you have a back rent situation that will be covered by it, you can also include some utilities costs in there as well. So it does sound like it's going to be a lot of resources. Absolutely. And I'm
Yeah.
excited to be working with you about what we do down the road, because landlords, as you mentioned, have a choice of whether they want to be involved in this program or not, because there is some guidelines on what behaviors we expect to see for folks who do accept the terms of that. So I suspect we will be back in touch at some point in the future to talk about what happens when we get into some of those complications. I know it's a little early to guess how that's going to work out, but I suspect we will have more to talk about in regard soon.
Mhm.
Does anybody have any questions for Andrew as far as how we can connect with with Law New York to be able to help our community members? Andrew, I really do appreciate you taking your time to join us. I am going to ask Rebecca to hop on, and maybe we can get a little more into this ERAP, the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. I know Housing Justice for All and Citizen Action have really been at the ground level, patiently waiting for this to come. Some
I would
not as
just add,
patient. I'm sorry, what was that?
sorry, just a final note, and then I'll mute myself. Yeah, if as far as how people can get a hold of us, we're still not taking in-person office appointments because of the pandemic. So, but our phone number where we can be reached at is 607-734-1647, and which I believe I've talked to you on before. And other than that, like I said, we have a website, www.lawny.org. So you can look up information there. That it's got the public information articles there. It's got information about how to contact us. But for now, we're not doing the in-person appointments. So the best way would be to get a hold of us by phone. But so with that, I will mute myself.
Thank you, Andrew, and I'll make sure we get that information in the chat, both in the Zoom room and in the Facebook page. Fantastic. Thank you so much for all of that. We really appreciate that. And Rebecca, my friend, are you here? There you are. Hello.
I am. I'm super excited to dig in on CRAP. Can I go back on a couple of things, if that's okay?
Oh.
You know, in terms of the moratorium, right? Like right now, we really want folks super focused on filling out the application for CRAP, because there's an assumption of acceptance as soon as you fill it out, which would prohibit a landlord from pursuing a non-payment eviction. So at this point, you definitely want to spend your time doing that, right? But just to go back and clarify a couple of things, I want to really plus one what Andrew said, that having an attorney, if you're able to, right, if there's capacity from Law New York, is enormously important. So that should be like a first point of contact. But the way the law was written around the eviction moratorium, if you fill out the declaration, a couple of things, right? One is the only exception really for an eviction proceeding is extreme nuisance, right? So it's not just that you broke the parameters of the lease. The only exception that should be moving through the courts, according to the legislation, is that there is an extreme nuisance behavior that's dangerous that the landlord can prove. I will flag that, of course, judicial discretion comes into play. And so while in some municipalities that standard is very, very high, we see in other municipalities that standard being low, and also just judges in some municipalities completely flouting the law that's been written. And so, you know, that speaks to a bigger problem that we have, that outside of New York City and Buffalo, there are not housing courts where, exactly. There are not housing courts where we have not only judges who are not specialized in housing law, but to be quite honest, judges who sometimes aren't even specialized in law, right? And so when you have oftentimes a tenant who may or may not be represented and oftentimes isn't represented, and you have a landlord who almost always has an attorney, and then you have a judge, it's like this perfect storm, right? Who doesn't have a background. It's so important. Absolutely, Becca. But judicial elections are a really under focused point of organizing, and so beyond housing, right? In terms of ending mass incarceration, a point of organizing that we should all be focusing on. Yeah, the Wild West. I call it that all the time, Andrew. You have some, so you have this perfect storm where judges will just basically defer to an attorney who appears before them. And 9 times out of 10, that's an attorney for the landlord, right? And so they assume that what's being presented to them by that attorney is correct. And that's not true. So the way the legislation is actually written in the eviction moratorium is that the only exception to the eviction moratorium is extreme nuisance behavior, which causes a severe risk to either the tenant or others who live in the building. Again, that sounds good on paper. In implementation points, that is been problematic, but I really want to flag that, right? The other thing I want to
Before we
just
go on,
flag,
can I ask you a question about that?
yeah, for sure.
So what I'm hearing is that unless there's an extreme nuisance, these shouldn't even be moving into court.
Correct. So if we're talking about lease violations that are related to somebody, like, I'm a tenant, right? And I have in my lease that I can't have a guest past 10 days. So if I had a guest 11 or 12 days and there were no associated claim of like illegal behavior attached to it, that would not be a reason to move an eviction forward before August 31st, right? That's a lease violation, but it is not something that's causing imminent risk to myself or the other tenants. And so really the only thing that should be moving any case forward is that claim. I also want to flag, and this is a problem we've seen in a lot of cases, is that unless the eviction proceeding that was, and I'm kind of getting into weeds, but I think this is important, right? Because this is just something I've dealt with in a lot of places. The law is very clear too. If there was a holdover eviction that was started, right? So that's a no fault eviction. And there was no claim in that holdover eviction proceeding of nuisance behavior. The only way that this legislation allows the claim of nuisance behavior to move forward is by starting a new claim. The only way you can sort of utilize the eviction proceedings that have already started and sort of turnkey them into this loophole is if you have embedded in the documents that were already filed. Sorry, I swallowed wrong. That there was nuisance behavior. And so we see a lot of judges kind of like on the fly being like, okay, you filed a holdover. Do you have nuisance behavior? That is 100% operating outside of the parameters of the way the legislation is supposed to work. And it's important because of all the things that Andrew mentioned, right? There are really strict timelines in terms of providing notice on an eviction, giving notice for a response to eviction, and then notice to appear in court. And so kind of resetting that legislative clock is really important, even if you're claiming nuisance eviction, right? Like judges shouldn't be allowing a case that's already in process that doesn't have nuisance claims already embedded in it to be moving through and just midstream be switched to nuisance. It's very clear in the legislation that if that wasn't already a factor in a pre-existing eviction case, that would have to be a new filing. And so that new filing would then build in all these time protections for tenants, right? Again, judicial discretion is working against us, but I think these are things that not only is it important for attorneys to raise, but I'm going to just note, and as somebody who like organizes across the state, it's important for local press to highlight, right? This manipulation of the system, this abuse of the system. And these are things that it's important for the AG's office to know and for OCA to know, right? The Office of Court Administration. And so I've certainly been filling OCA in on the lack of compliance by upstate judges in regards to the legislation and how it was laid out. I'll pause there before I go on to the other thing in the eviction moratorium I want to talk about, and I apologize for taking a step back, but I think these things are really important.
Absolutely, and it brings me to another question, because this is one that we've heard frequently around the county. landlords who say, well, yeah, there's an eviction moratorium, but I write my leases so it doesn't apply. Now,
That's not a thing. Yeah,
exactly.
that's like not a thing.
So
There
the
is no such a
examples that we're
lease.
hearing are, well, but my lease is month to month, which means next month they could just decide they don't want to renew it. That's the
Yeah,
holdover you're talking about, right? Like
yeah,
there is a
exactly, right? Like
holdover.
it covers all of those, right? And I think Andrew spoke really importantly about that, right? The public education around what people's rights are, right? Like if you get a letter from your landlord saying I'm evicting you at the end of the month, so many tenants don't know that that's not legally enforceable. It feels enforceable. It feels scary. It feels like you don't want to wait for law enforcement to show up at your door because you think that's a viable option that's about to happen. And it's one of our biggest hurdles in enforcing rights that we win is the public education around what these rights are so that tenants know that they can self-enforce them.
Absolutely, absolutely. I have nightmares still to this day about the time when my kids were little and we got a 3-day eviction notice and I didn't know anything from anything. I thought that meant I had 3 days to get out, and we literally piled everything on our car and moved all through the night to try to get out of there before the police came, because we thought for sure that was also going to now equal CPS because now we're in an apartment that we've been kicked out of. So like, what does that do to us?
Yeah,
Like, it was
yeah.
terrifying. So
Which is why
absolutely.
forums like this, Becca, are so important because the public education just has to coexist, right, with the like legal mechanisms to help enforce.
Absolutely. Thank you.
The other thing I wanted to just note is the financial impact from COVID. This moratorium hardship declaration form is really generous in what impact looks like, right? So yes, right, it can be that I lost income due to the pandemic, but it also leaves space for saying impact looks like my childcare costs increase, right? So for a lot of people, maybe you didn't lose your job, but all of a sudden you had to work from home, or maybe you didn't lose your job and you went to work, but your kid's school went remote, and all of a sudden there was nowhere to send them. So you had to pay a babysitter or a daycare provider, right? This specifically includes that kind of financial impact. It's not limited to job loss. And it also includes health impact, right? So if you were impacted in a health capacity from COVID, I say this because it's very generous, right? I don't want people to think, okay, I didn't technically lose a day of work, so I'm not going to qualify for this moratorium hardship declaration. That's not true, right? There are parameters around which you can apply because of a family member getting sick, you getting sick, your childcare costs changed, that all would allow you to qualify under this.
There was another piece to that that I thought was really fascinating too. They talked about, okay, so I didn't work at all last year, but I just got a job last month. So if I give you pay stubs, it's not going to look like I qualify. So if I heard them correctly, they were saying that you can either use tax forms for last year or the last 4 months, whichever one is, or the last 4 weeks, whatever is going to help you to qualify for the program. Is that what I heard?
Yeah, that's right. And let's go into CRAP. I think that's a good shift, right? So no program is perfect, but much like the moratorium, and I'll keep saying this, right? I think all states were kind of flooded with federal funding to address what is an unprecedented rental crisis for both tenants and landlords, right? Let's be real, right? I have zero sympathy for landlords who have profited during this pandemic, but I do recognize that there are some landlords who own one property, right? And this was their retirement mechanism. You know what I mean? Right? Like we stand in solidarity, right, with the 99%, against the 1%. And in that 99%, there includes some landlords, right? And so we're in this together, right? And we shouldn't let this narrative divide us, right? All of us are on in different ways, shapes, and forms, and some of us feel it differently, but all of us are still one paycheck, 1 month, one situation away, right, from being insolvent, homeless, unhoused. And so I think it's important to include those, right? We're not anti-landlord, we're anti-profiteering, corporate developer.
Anti-exploitation.
Yeah, right. So in terms of who qualifies, right? There's the program that passed in May was so bad, and I think, thankfully, right? I want to say one thing, right? Organizing in communities across the state has won us this, right? And so every single person who's listening, who fought to make it better, should really sit in this moment, right? Because their work is why, yes, May 2020, their work is why we won what we won, right? And really, like, let's remember that, because organizing matters, and fighting matters, and getting involved matters. So in May, I won't even go into it, but there were all these really horrific provisions that made sure almost nobody applied. Nobody qualified. So here we have something that's much better, and honestly the best in the country in terms of implementation of federal funding. So first and foremost, in terms of proving impact, undocumented folks are explicitly included, right? So it says we need identification. So if you have a Social Security card, great, you can provide that. But it also says, like, you could have a school ID, right? You could have your work ID. You could have, you could have a non-American passport as an ID. There's a whole host of options for what your ID could look like. It doesn't even have to be like a non-driver's license ID here in the US, which we do have in New York, that would qualify you as just an ID. And that's really, really important. Number two is, we know that our undocumented neighbors and our gig workers and those who work in the informal economy don't have traditional financial documents. And this really sought to address, not to exclude those folks. So if you have W-2s, great, right? If you have your taxes from last year, great. But if in the absence of those documents, if you're somebody that cleans houses and you don't file taxes because you're undocumented, you wish you could, right? But this state and this country haven't recognized that would be a value add for us. You can sign a hardship, you can sign a declaration form that says, right, I suffered a financial loss, but I'm unable to provide you with the documents that others may traditionally be able to provide you with. And that's huge. It's literally just huge. The third thing I want to note is, in May, we had a large problem with folks who received unemployment, and with the expanded unemployment in their area, it put them over the 80% AMI. And so they were on unemployment, they got the unexpanded employment, and then yet they didn't get rent relief, right? But we know that people who exist in these situations, right? I get so frustrated and hear, well, if you were making more, why couldn't you pay your rent? Here's my answer to that, right? Is like, we have folks who are choosing between like dental appointment for their kids, right? Shoes for their kids, clothing for their kids, right? Feeding their children, all of these things just to keep a roof over their family's head. And so in a moment where there's a moratorium and maybe they have a little bit more money, yeah, right, some folks chose to say, okay, right, there was a surgery my child needed and I haven't been able to afford it, and I'm gonna provide it to them, right? My kids have been walking around with their toes sticking out of their shoes, and I'm going to make sure, right, their feet are warm and they're clothed in a way that's dignified. And so yes, there are folks who received expanded unemployment and couldn't pay their rent, but they automatically didn't qualify in some areas. This legislation specifically says that if you received unemployment, you automatically qualify. That's it. You literally just have to show your paperwork that showed you received unemployment, and you automatically qualify. That's it. You don't have to show anything other than that. So it really fixed a lot of these things that were deeply problematic in the May bill. I think some of the other things I want to know, and I'm sorry I'm taking so much time, but once you apply, you are presumed to be accepted. So the second you apply, you cannot be subject to a non-payment eviction until you're denied, right? That's really important. So we want to get folks applying. Folks should not be wondering, will I qualify or not, right? And I think too, the federal restrictions require that folks are 80% or AMI or less. Here's what I would say to everybody. Don't worry about figuring that out. Apply. If you're not 80% AMI, the state will tell you, right? There is no harm, no foul, nothing to be lost for applying. Every single person who owes rent should just apply honestly with all their documents, honestly with what they made. The vast majority of people will qualify, right? And while they figure that out, you're going to be protected against a non-payment eviction until you're denied. And so don't look at this process and say, how do I know if I'm 80% AMI? Don't worry about it. The state will tell you if you're 80% AMI or not. Don't even let that be a blip on your radar. Just fill it out and apply. Period, end of story. As Andrew said, it does have an allowance for moving forward. So it can pay up to 12 months back rent, 100%, right? And part of what May too, exactly. If you're honest, the worst they can do is say no. And I'm just responding to Andrew in the chat. In May, even if you were accepted, you still had to pay 30% of your income. Or if you were rent burdened before, that rent burden portion, even if you're accepted, it was bananas, right? This will pay 100% of the rent you're owed if you're accepted. It is a huge improvement, up to 12 months previous, and potentially 3 months in the future prospectively. 3 months in the future. So it's really, really important, right? Recognizing that while we're coming out of the pandemic, we are not out of it yet, and not everybody has recovered. And the other thing I really want to name that this goes to like asserting rights and is just so hugely important. If you are accepted, your landlord has to give you a year of good cause eviction protection and a year of a rent freeze. So this goes beyond not just being subject to a non-payment eviction. That's a year where you can't get a holdover eviction. Period, end of story. That's a year where you can't get a no-fault eviction. That's a year where your rent cannot be increased. What do we know though? Are landlords going to honor that without enforcement? Most won't, right? The good ones will, of course they will. We're going to have predatory landlords who still send you a notice 2 months afterwards to say your rent is going up. And so we have to have tenants who know that they're able to say, you can't do that, right? You took rent relief and I'm entitled to a year of a rent freeze. And that 100% will be held up in court. I would be shocked if that wasn't held up in court anywhere, because it's just one of those like really black and white, no gray interpretation scenarios like we have in these other. It is literally black and white. If you take the money, you cannot raise the rent for a year. If you take the money, you cannot initiate a holdover eviction for a year. Period.
And those are both, that's like absolutely amazing stuff. There's two things I want to lift up along with that. First of all, I want us to recognize how lucky we are to be in Chemung County and have access to this program, understanding that there are municipalities in New York State who have, as municipalities, decided they were not going to participate. Monroe County is not a part of this. So if you live in Rochester, you are dealing with an ERAP program that will be administered by Monroe County and not the one that we're talking about. The same goes with Onondaga County, where Syracuse is. There's a couple other on the other side of the state, but those would be the ones that would be the closest to our folks here. So let's remember also that by being in Chemung County, we're really lucky to have access to this program. And Rebecca, the other thing I was hoping that you could talk about a little bit, I understand that this also includes some protections for folks if their landlords decide not to participate. Because as you pointed out, there are some guidelines. There might be landlords out there who are like, well, I don't want to give them a year of good cause and a year of not being able to hike their rent. So I'm not going to participate and I'm not going to agree to take that money, or I'm just going to dodge the system and just ignore all the requests I get. What can tenants do when they get to that point?
Yeah, and I'm glad you raised that because I had forgotten to mention it. One of our biggest fears was because of the really strong tenant protections that are embedded in this, that we would have landlords who'd say, okay, I'll forego the money to be able to evict my tenant. And so what this says, right, the whole part of the process requires cooperation on both sides of the applicant, right? What this says is if the tenant applies, and what will automatically happen is the state will contact the landlord to verify, right, that this amount of rent is owed and that this is in fact a tenant in their building, which is expected and normal, right? Before you're going to pay the landlord this money, like, does this person live, right, in your building? Do they owe you this much money, right? And the landlord would have to say, yes, they do. So landlords who refuse to participate in that process in the hopes that they can therefore just evict their tenant because they're sort of opting out of this. I forget if it's 2 or 3, but it's either 2 or 3 touches by the state to the landlord. In the absence of a response, every tenant will receive a letter from the state saying, right, we've attempted to contact your landlord. Your landlord has refused to participate in this. And that letter will serve as an affirmative defense against a non-payment eviction. So if you were to be brought to court for a non-payment eviction by your landlord, you simply bring that letter, and it would 100% should stop a non-payment eviction. And really what the law does is equate it to source of income discrimination, right? So as of April 2019, where we had discrimination classes that existed before, right? An inability to discriminate against race, which all of these things, right? We know are still on paper rights and not always in reality rights, but we had on paper rights in terms of race, sexual preference, all these other things. In April 2019, they added source of income discrimination. And so really what this legislation does is equate this to that, right? And it says a refusal to accept this money is the same thing as participating in source of income discrimination. And so when you bring that letter, it should be, right, a non-optional affirmative defense against non-payment. And if after 12 months, the landlord still refuses to participate, right, which would be unbelievably foolish because it should prohibit any non-payment eviction. So why would you not take the money? But if for some reason landlords be landlords, it is also wiped off the record and not something you owe anymore. So tenants don't have to worry about this debt following them in terms of a credit sense or as they go to seek other housing, right? A sort of bad, a blemish on their rental record sense. So the landlord has 12 months to cooperate, or it gets literally wiped. That debt is wiped off the tenant's record.
Whew, that sounds like the start to cancel rent. Whew, you got me all excited with that one. Yeah, so I am really excited about this program coming in. I feel like we have a really great opportunity here. And it sounds to me like the strongest tenant, the strongest individual resources that we have in our hands right now are the Hardship Declaration, filling out the ERAP system when it goes live on Tuesday, and making sure that you're getting in touch with an attorney if you have any kind of information from your landlord indicating that they're looking to evict you. So I think that on the individual side, we've done a fabulous job. Does anybody have any last minute comments or questions about the individual side before we start talking about what we can do as a community? All right, well, I am going to start us off with a little video that talks about the importance of community organizing and what kind of power we can generate when we choose to do that. See you in a minute.
When elected officials see Georgia Stand Up coming with our orange shirts on with the community, and they say, "Oh, what do you want now?" When we hear that they're concerned about our issues because we're showing up with 50 to 100 people, and people are demanding in a responsible way that their elected officials serve them, that's community power.
What public health is really starting to get is the social determinants of health. They understand that health inequities are the result of inequities in housing and in transportation, in criminal justice, and all of these areas.
It's not just about, visiting a doctor, but it's about parks, and it's about access to food, and it's about whether you're safe walking home from school.
Whether you have a roof over your head, transportation, a job where you can afford to put healthy food on the table for yourself and your families.
One of the things that we've been insisting on for a very long period of time was the power of organizing.
Righteous rage is centered in love. So rage is not the opposite of love, right? Indifference is the opposite of love. And that's what our communities have been experiencing.
To have our communities really live comfortably and with dignity, we need to ensure that they're getting paid for what their work is worth, and that rents or housing costs are simply manageable.
If neighborhoods aren't organized, especially with so much development happening so rapidly, this is when displacement happens.
There's, data out there now to tell you how long you're going to live by your zip code. Housing is the nucleus to all these other intersectional issues. When I see the suffering in our communities, when I see that elected officials are ignoring the desires of the electorate and they haven't expanded Medicaid and people are actually dying, we need to build more power.
Clayton County has the world's busiest airport. The county actually stopped bus service. And so many of the residents were walking alongside the streets and the sidewalks looking for a way to get to work.
If we've got community members identifying what the problems are, identifying what the solutions are, and doing the organizing and power building that lifts those obstacles, it's very different than if an agency comes in from outside.
Any attempt to transform this system has to be led by and informed by the wisdom, the experience, and the intelligence, frankly, of those who have lived and been discriminated against by those systems.
The solution is to organize the people in such a way that they understand and believe and know that they are the power.
The City of Boulder sees organizing as a tool that can support community members and support the health of individuals and entire neighborhoods. When we do get community involved, better policies are passed.
In 2016, we passed a ballot initiative to increase the minimum wage to $12. In 2019, we passed a bill to allow local municipalities to increase their own minimum wage.
Community power gives us the opportunity to really have a platform to talk about what's most important to us. Our goal is to make housing a human right. For every effort that we embark on, there's a legislative approach, organizing and boots on the ground strategy, a litigation communications, and there's a technology strategy.
We had coalition members come together. We knocked on doors. We called people. We had activities to get the awareness out there. And we were surprised that people were willing to tax themselves to get transportation. Every time I see that bus go up the street, I just get excited because we know that we were a part of that success.
We cannot continue down this path where so many people do not have access to the basic and fundamental ingredients for a healthy and balanced life.
for public health to really make an impact on health inequity, then it needs to shift power imbalances that are fueled by various forms of oppression like racism and sexism.
And now there's a big opening to understand that public health will only be achieved if communities have the power to voice their concerns and shift the political calculus that decides where resources get directed.
If we are going to build a society that works for all of our families, it is critical that we evaluate the problems and that we develop solutions through a race, gender, and class lens. Not one or the other, but all of it.
I thought that was a really powerful way to talk about how important it is to harness the power of our communities. Because when we come together, there's very little that can stop us from anything. And I think even just hearing about the individual resources that we heard about in the first half of this program can give us a lot of strong ideas of ways that we can come together as a community. I would love to see us maybe table at some of the farmers markets with some hardship declarations and some information on the ERAP program and how folks can apply for it. Maybe we could get a team of folks together who would be willing to go knock on some doors and talk about housing justice. Another opportunity available that I'm going to take advantage of this afternoon. Coming up next week, we're going to have a statewide set of actions talking about the Honda bill, the Housing Our Neighbors with Dignity Act. We're looking to use some of the old abandoned hotels and transform them into homeless housing. We're asking folks to take pictures of themselves in front of some dilapidated hotels, and Lord knows we have enough of those in Chemung County. Let's go get some pictures of ourselves in front of those and tell our legislators, use this property to help the homeless. Don't let it just sit here and grow mold. So a lot of things that we could do locally, and I would love to talk to folks, anybody who's watching the program who has interest in this, poweractionlight@gmail.com. I will be happy to talk to you and set up some times that we can get together and go start canvassing the neighborhood and find other folks who want to help us to tip these scales. Rebecca, what kind of experience have you seen with community organizing around the state? I know you have a lot to do with this everywhere you go.
Yeah, it's funny because, I've always worked on housing because it was embedded right in the crisis that communities feel. But I would say prior to 2019, organizing around housing, right, existed in New York City in a really well-organized, powerful way. But it was really sporadic and hard to find outside of New York City. And so what I've seen in my organizing since 2019 is a recognition that housing insecurity is something that touches every town, every village, every city in New York. It is not specific to New York City. And so with that recognition comes the recognition that that type of organizing around that trauma and that manifestation, right, of racial capitalism is so vitally important. There's so many ways our communities are impacted, right, through healthcare, through education, through access to jobs and environmental violence. But maybe it's my bias, but I always think of housing as the sort of epicenter of all of it, right? Through the redlining, right, that this country was built on since it was colonized from the indigenous folks on the backs of enslaved Africans. Everything is defined by where you're housed and whether it's stably or unstably. And that really defines your educational access, your access to jobs, your access to healthcare, how much environmental violence impacts you, right? And so in terms of organizing around that, I think there's a huge awakening of that fact outside of New York City in the last 2 years. And an enormous grassroots power that's being built around that. That I know, right? I have faith will set us up to win equity. Is it easy? No, right? Is it short term? No. But is it winnable? Is it doable? Yes, right? Is it worth throwing debt on? 100%. And it's highly motivating to our members because it's just the epicenter of everything else that impacts them.
Absolutely, absolutely. So yeah, I strongly encourage anybody who happens to be watching the program to reach out to us either through a Facebook message or an email. I would be happy to talk about collaborating and how we can really start to get this information into the hands of the folks who live in Chemung County. And that, brings us to how do we build this team and what kind of things can we do as a team to really improve things here in Chemung County and make housing more accessible and affordable and safe and all the things that we need it to be. So with that, I'm going to turn our conversation into talking a little bit about good cause eviction, what that means and what our role in that could be. So bear with me one more second and we're going to have another 2-minute video. See you in a minute.
New Yorkers are facing an unprecedented housing crisis. Millions of people are living under the constant threat of exorbitant rent hikes, rundown apartment conditions, and arbitrary eviction from their homes.
Tenants from across New York, from Long Island to Buffalo, are losing their homes. Many are entering homeless shelters or are left without any place to live. By the end of 2019, over 90,000 people in New York State were homeless.
But there's a solution that would help keep families in their homes and out of homelessness.
The Good Cause Eviction Bill gives tenants across New York State the right to a renewal lease and protection against unreasonable rent increases.
Currently, New Yorkers living in unregulated apartments do not have the right to renew their leases and can be evicted simply at the landlord's whim without any good cause.
Last year alone, 20,000 households in New York City were evicted by city marshals. This doesn't even include the thousands of families who were forced to move when landlords hiked their rents. We cannot wait any longer.
The Good Cause Eviction Bill would cover all rental units in New York, except for those in small owner-occupied buildings, and would give tenants the right to organize for safe living conditions, dignity, and stability in their homes.
Hardworking New Yorkers deserve permanent, affordable housing in order to continue doing the jobs that make New York one of the best places in the world.
Albany legislators must stand up for tenants and continue building on the historic housing reforms passed in 2019 to truly protect all tenants.
In 2020, we must pass good cause eviction legislation to protect New Yorkers.
So yeah, good cause is a really important thing that we can talk about here in our community. It is something that has been presented to the New York State Legislature and asked them to approve it for the state. But as we know, we're less than 2 weeks away from the end of the legislative session, so I'll let Rebecca talk about where we're at as far as that goes. But we've also had experience in Albany with pushing good cause just in Albany, and that might also be an example for something that we could aspire to here in Chemung County. Rebecca, could you talk to us a little bit about all that?
Yeah, I'd love to. And I'd love to just start by framing us in what good cause is, if that's okay, Becca. While good cause is framed as being radical, it is truly the most basic rights that every New Yorker should have. And to give some context to that, right? I think New York is often framed as this sort of radical, progressive state. The statewide legislation on good cause is modeled after the New Jersey legislation that has existed in New Jersey for about 35 years. So New Jersey, hardly a bastion of progressive values, has had this exact same legislation in place for 35 years. Other states that have it include Washington, California, a version of it exists in Colorado, and multiple municipalities across the country. So this is not a case of New York going rogue. This is one of those really unfortunate cases of New York lagging inexcusably far behind on what are really basic rights that should exist. So I really want to start there. What good cause says is that it really says two things, right? Right now in New York, a landlord can evict a tenant without cause. That's the holdover eviction we talked about earlier. A tenant can be fulfilling every obligation of their lease if they don't have a lease, every obligation of their month-to-month tenancy, paying the rent, taking care of the property. And a landlord can simply say, I'm taking back the property, you're evicted without cause. We want extensions to the timeline to that in 2019, but that's all we want, right? So if you live there up to a year, you get 30 days, up to 2 years, you get 60 days, 2 years or over, you get 90 days notice, but it doesn't keep you in your home. And so good cause says that in order to evict a tenant, a landlord must have cause. The causes are all the things you would think of as reasonable: non-payment, illegal activities happening on the property, damage to the property, a threat to the safety of other residents that live in the property. All of the things you would think of as reasonable causes. And I think a lot of people actually assume that there has to be a cause for eviction, and they think of this sort of list as the things that exist would qualify. It simply says you can't have no reason to evict somebody. And so why is this so important? We see holdover evictions, no-fault evictions being used in almost exclusively two capacities, right? One is in retaliation. We have property owners whose entire business model is designed on profiting off of disinvestment in their property, right? These are the slumlords. So they buy a property cheap. They know there's a housing crisis. They know people are desperate, right? Desperate for housing that they can afford. And so they buy properties. They know right from the get-go that they are not going to adhere to the most basic safety criteria or mechanisms, like hot water, heat, no lead, no mold. I'm talking the most basic, right? They know that they're not going to adhere to maintain those minimum standards. And so when a tenant complains that I have no hot water, I have no heat, I have sewage coming out of my bathtub faucet when I try to bathe my child. If somebody complains, they immediately initiate a holdover eviction in retaliation. And so tenants across New York who are vulnerable to this, which is 5 million in the state of New York, if you're not a rent regulated tenant, or if you're not a public housing tenant or a Section 8 tenant, you are vulnerable to holdover eviction. So the 5 million tenants that covers, don't complain. There's nowhere else to go. And so they suffer with no mechanism to be able to
I wonder if your internet might be getting a little unstable there. Look, it sounds like you might close.
with no mechanism to be able to force or act. The one reason that holdover evictions are used, and the other is to gentrify an area, right? Investment in these disinvested communities, which that's a whole separate conversation as to whether that's the solution. But here's what I do know, right? When you say the answer to almost always black and brown is 100% always
Rebecca, I think you're getting a little unstable. I'm going to
development,
stop your
right?
video and see if that'll help us.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah,
That's all right.
right. Is that better?
Yes. Thank
Okay.
you.
We know that local officials love to court development, right? And they court development as the solution to disinvested communities, which are almost always black and brown, always low income. And the reality is that, and we can have a whole nother conversation on whether that's the appropriate solution, but the reality is that when that happens, right, and development is courted, it is never to the benefit of those people who lived there generationally and suffered through that disinvestment. And so we have new development coming in, whether it looks like housing that's wealthier, whether it looks like improved roads or new stores and healthcare access, right? What it results in is the displacement and gentrification of the communities who've suffered through the disinvestment. It never, ever, 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 ever benefits those communities. It just displaces them. And so why is that, right? It sort of manifests itself in two ways through holdover evictions. One is you have speculators, developers who buy up buildings and say, okay, I'm going to flip this into luxury housing to import wealthier people, often whiter people. And they just do a mass sweep of the building. And so they do a mass issuance of holdover evictions, which is perfectly legal. And then the other problem we have is that even if you're not in the speculator has bought it or a developer is building, if you're in proximity to that development, your rents increase just because of proximity to new buildings, new resources. Your landlord has not put a dime into the building, right? Their costs have not increased in any way, shape, or form. But because of this proximity, they maximize their profits. And so your rents all of a sudden have doubled in a couple of years, and you can literally no longer afford to live there and therefore benefit from the investment and resources that you were promised would improve your life. And
Those are
so
many great points. Holy cow. And I'm seeing that play out in Elmira right now so clearly. With
yeah,
this new medical school. And you're hearing folks talk about there's money available to help them to fix up the houses, but they don't want to spend it because then their taxes will go up. So
yep,
let's just leave people in these rundown buildings and hope that a medical student is going to rent it out next time.
yep, exactly. And so what good cause, how it protects it is in two ways. One, it says you have to have cause to evict someone. So it protects against their retaliation. But in the second scenario that we were just talking about, sweeping a building, right, to convert it to housing doesn't qualify as a good cause. And so a tenant who's fulfilling the obligations of their tenancy get to stay. And that exists through transition of ownership. So if a speculator, a developer buys the building and you have been a tenant who fulfills the obligations of your tenancy, even the new owner can't evict you because they want to convert it to something that's going to generate a higher income. Two is it equates an unreasonable rent increase to an arbitrary eviction. So it says anything above 3% or 1.5 times the consumer price index, whichever is higher, is the equivalent So in the example I gave where you're in proximity to development, your landlord, just because all of these resources are popping up around you, because they haven't invested in the property. Where it's reasonable is that if the landlord's costs have increased, they can go above that 3%, right? If, again, right, we stand in solidarity with the small landlords who are struggling too. If you have to replace a roof, you can go above that amount. If the boiler goes, you can go above that amount. If your property tax is increased, you can go above that amount, right? But it just said to go above, your costs have increased to go above the 3% threshold. And if you can do that, you can go above it. It is enormously important. Enormously important. If we are ever going to start to stabilize the rental housing market, this must happen. And again, so many other states have recognized this.
With less than 2 weeks left in the legislative session, do we see any hope for it for this year?
We don't. Sadly, Becca, it's not going to pass this year, right? So this is the third year in a row that we are going to have the session end without winning this. And so I can't beg folks enough to organize around this over the summer and into the fall so that 2022 is the year we win it. In terms of your point on local fights, Albany, the mayor of Albany introduced local good cause legislation in, I want to say around March. And we are currently, it's in committee at the council level. It's municipalities can do this. And it's important, municipalities can do this. And it's important for municipalities to do this, not only for their communities, but it really, I'm so sorry, my internet is, I'm so sorry. It influences what's happening at the state level as well, because it shows that this is like an urgent need that's happening around the state. So local campaigns are enormously important, not just for those municipalities, but in terms of moving our statewide legislation.
Awesome, awesome. So one thing that I'm going to suggest that we do as the PAL, do I remember correctly that Housing Justice for All has some information on good cause that we could get our hands on? I'm not sure if Rebecca can hear me right now, but hopefully we will be able to get back in touch with her on that. That's really what I would like us to focus on at this point. Let's get out to some farmers markets and see if we can get some hardship declarations and some ERAP information into people's hands so that they can start working on that. But also let's start educating people on what good cause is, how we could fight for it for the state throughout the summer, and also learn how to develop our own programs so that we could perhaps fight for that in Chemung County as well. It sounds like a lot of really strong resources that would absolutely help us as a community. And I really appreciate this time. We do have one other person in the Zoom room today. Tanisha, did you have anything you wanted to add, my friend?
No, I'm just very excited to be here and to, be part of this and to see what we can do to help.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. All right. Well, I have a phone that's deciding to do what it wants to do. Hold on one second. All right. So I really do appreciate everybody coming together with us today. I am going to go ahead and close out the program. Sorry, my phone's ringing at the same time. So thank you everybody for coming. We are going to get together again at the end of June. It will be June, bear with me one second, June 26th. We will be back live talking about good cause eviction and some updates hopefully on ERAB. Rebecca, I don't know if your internet will allow you, but did you have any parting comments you'd like to make before we wrap up today?
Just so sorry about my internet. I am in a rural part of the state, and that means my internet is challenging. But no, just thank you, Becca, for all the work you do in an area that desperately needs all of this. And so honored to be in the fight with you.
Thank you, and I am so appreciative of you bringing the wealth of knowledge you have and passion for organizing around housing to not only here in Chemung County with the PAL, but also through the New York State PPC. I really appreciate your time. And thank you everybody else who joined us today. I got you out of here a half an hour early. Congratulations. Let's enjoy our Saturday. And thank you again, everybody. Have a great day.